So let me introduce our first guest, and it's a real honour to be doing so as well. The Honourable Pastor Andrew Evans has been around the traps quite a bit in ministry and in politics in Australia, and has been recognised with really what's the highest order in this country of honour, and that is the Order of Australia Medal. He's as I said, been in ministry and politics, started a little church in Adelaide. I think it's only a small one, and still going strong. He's been a member of much of the move of God in this country. And I'm sure you've had an opportunity to read through the information on the blog there. But it is just such an honour and a privilege to have you here tonight, Pastor Andrew, and so I'll hand over to you as we wrestle with this big question, where to now for the church. So each of our speakers tonight have 9 minutes, and as they're speaking, please put your questions in the chat. That'd be fantastic. So Andrew, it's over to you.
Thank you for your kind invitation and introduction. It's lovely to be here and see this great work that you're doing through this station. You know, this worry about this virus that we have and how things are going in the world now, bad it is. God gave us the answer 3,000 years ago. And it was when the wisest man in the world had a visitation from God. His name was King Solomon. And Solomon was in his peak. Everything was going fantastic for him. He was building the temple. He'd conquered all the nations around him. He'd become incredibly rich. And life couldn't have been better. And then one early morning, God came to him and said to him, you know, there's going to be famines and there's going to be pestilence and there's going to be these kind of issues. It's not all going to be like this. It's not all going to be so marvelous. But if my people, who are called by my name, will humble themselves and pray, I will hear from heaven, forgive their sins, and heal their land. Now that is an unchanging principle that has worked every time. The first time I saw it in action was 60 years ago. Australia invited a young evangelist called Billy Graham to Australia. 2 years before he came, he sent his team. And they went all around Australia urging churches and setting up prayer meetings. So when he came, there'd been a massive amount of prayer along these lines that were encouraged by King Solomon. The result of his visit was the greatest move Australia's ever had. This is some of the statistics. Over 3 million people, that's a third of Australians at that time, heard him and attended to his meetings in person. In Melbourne, they had the largest crowd to the MCG ever, 143,000. In Sydney, they had to take 2 stadiums, 150,000. There was 2% of the Australian population made decisions for Christ, and many of the great leaders we've had since then were converted in those meetings. And then we settled down. Just as Jesus said, you ought always to pray and not to give up. But we do tend to give up. And so we gradually slipped away and gradually slipped away until 60 years later, we got to that stage of backsliding as a nation that we began to legislate sin. And when you legislate and your parliaments sin, the nation is in for trouble. And it looked pretty bad for Australia. It looked as if there was no hope, but a 77-year-old lady in Perth was woken up at 4 in the morning, and this is what she said. Her name was none other than the great Margaret Court. And she said, I believe it's time for the church to arise with a strong voice of righteousness, truth, and justice. God woke me at 4 a.m. on the 8th of March with these words. And then she went on to say there's going to be a shift and a shifting in this nation. And he said, I've given you a Christian prime minister, and if you will rise and pray and humble yourself and do as Chronicles tells us to do, I will heal your land. So for the first time for 60 years, I began to notice the whole of the church got so worried about the future of Australia that by and large, multitudes of Christians began to pray like they've never prayed before. And everyone said, no, Scott Morrison, he's just had a short term, he's gone, and he will never get in. But to the surprise of everybody, he had a miracle, and he won. The miracle also was that I was there on the day at his church, preaching in his church at the same day that he won the elections. It wasn't planned by him or me. I was the last choice because they had a guest speaker who got sick in the last minute, and they yelled out to me in the last minute to come. But it was a phenomenal day where we saw an answer to prayer as we humbled ourselves, sought after God with everything we had, and the result is we saw a miracle in the government of Australia. Now our challenge is to keep going. And I believe that's what we need to start doing now and keep going for revival for Australia, but turn this nation around to bring it back to its roots and let us see God mightily move on this nation. He may be using this pandemic to try to send people back to God. But with all the technology, we were reaching millions more. For instance, my son has got a church in Melbourne where everything's shut down. Well, he's gone online and just does it online. Well, he tells me he has 1 million people listening to him in his church. He then decided they generally have in June, they have a first fruits offering to help their ministry, what they're going. And he says, we didn't know whether to cancel it because no one could come to church and we're just doing it online. And they said, no, we'll keep going with it. So he kept his first fruits offering online and he got $2 million. So the church is just still growing and exploding. And we've got another thing to our channel. When we get back into church, which is important for discipling and so on, we've still got this channel of outreach, which all of them have found now of a new way of getting the message out there. And I've got a feeling that we're going to move forward mightily for a great latter-day revival. Now, Jesus understood this, and he said, you ought always to pray in Luke 18 and not to give up. Then he goes down to verse 8 and he says, when the Son comes back, he's referring to Jesus coming back. When he comes back, will he find faith on the earth? Question mark. So we have to look at the scriptures and see what it says about that. Well, there are two streams. One says there's going to be a falling away and a decline. And another says there's going to be a revival. And it seems that the key of prayer, of persistence that he talked about in that chapter is what he wants if we're going to see a revival. And in some of the countries in the world, they put it to test, like in Korea, and they've seen the change of nation from a Buddhist nation to a Christian nation. We can do the same. Let's get into it, prayer with everything we've got, and see God mightily move. Amen.
Amen. Fantastic. So do we have any questions?
I don't know when my time's up, so you better interrupt.
Well, you're doing well. You've gone under time, so you're not a preacher. Most preachers I know go over time. So do we have any questions from the floor? We've got an amen there, so thank you, Sawato, for that. Some questions from the floor for Pastor Andrew. And if you could put those in the chat box, that would be great. I have one, and I think you touched on this, Andrew. What do you think is the primary key, the number one thing that we need to be doing right now, not only for Australia to have a turn, but for the world to turn its face to the Lord?
I think there's no other thing that people have to really pray. I mean, you take the New Guinea church. I was there when its infancy. And they had just in 1948 they started. 1958 I got there. 63 I got there rather. And but the missionaries had set up prayer meetings every day of the week for the few Christians that were there. And every morning you'd lay in your bed in your house and you'd hear them down the church praying. And they'd be praying it before they went out into their workplace. These are primitive people who could hardly read and write. And so they started this prayer going. Today, the 70 years since they started, they are 20% of Papua New Guinea belong to our movement, along as the other Pentecostals. There's something like 600,000 and 3,500 churches, all indigenous, running their own shows, having taken their own offerings, praying, because prayer is always the key. Jesus did nothing until he'd fasted and prayed 40 days. And after that, it says he came back in the power of the Spirit.
Wonderful. So obviously we need to be praying ourselves, but what I'm hearing you say is, as leaders, we need to be leading other people to pray, creating opportunity and inviting them in.
Yes. Jesus our problem with prayer is we do give up, just as Jesus said in Luke 18. You're always to pray, not to give up. So he gave us a motivation. And the motivation was, if you pray, you'll see God move. If you don't, you won't. That's the last day church. You're going to have nothing happening if you don't pray. But if you really get into prayer, you'll have a move of God.
All right.
And the churches that are trying that, it works.
Thank you so much, Pastor Andrew. Really appreciate what you've had to say here tonight. We're going to move on now to